Welcome to In Your Neighborhood. I'm your host, Chris O'Rourke, and we have something special for you. This has been a historic year for us, 2020. We have the pandemic, and we have done our episodes called Conversations on COVID-19. But then a little bit ago, something happened in Minneapolis, the murder of George Floyd. And what resulted was protest marches not only in America, but across the world, as we've seen a tremendous push for racial equity. And it's an issue that we could not ignore here in the central Susquehanna Valley. So we are very fortunate to be joined by three people here today. Dr. Stacey Pearson-Wharton, the Dean of Health and Wellness and Director of the Counseling Center at Susquehanna University. Amy Davis, the Program Coordinator for Student Diversity and Inclusion at Susquehanna. And Nissan Trotter, the owner of Trot Fitness in Lewisburg. Welcome all today.
Hello.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much.
We'll get to all this stuff in a second, but I really want to start off first just by hearing of your backgrounds. Where did you grow up? How did you get to the central Susquehanna Valley? Dr. Pearson-Wharton, we'll start with you if you don't mind.
Of course. So I worked in the higher ed space now for about 25 years, and I came to Susquehanna University with the intent of being a consultant. And we would be here for about 6 months, and the plan was to find another job and work there. And I actually fell in love with both the town and the people and the university, and accidentally, but quite purposefully, if that makes sense. And so my husband says that this will be the story that will be told at my retirement party in 20 years, but that's kind of how I got to this place. I grew up in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, along with South Carolina as well, but we moved here from Florida.
Okay, that's a big jump.
A little bit. And we moved in January. The day that we moved, it was negative 10 degrees, something like that.
Oh, that's a terrible introduction.
Awesome.
Yeah, not good.
Okay, Amy, let's move on to you if you don't mind. Your background?
Absolutely. So I was born in Colombia, South America, and I was actually adopted as an infant and brought directly to Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. So I have spent, with a few short stints in other places, I have been in this community for most of my 33 years of life.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
And then Nissan Trotter, how about you?
Yes, I'm originally from the deep South, Silver Hill, Alabama, and I was recruited to play football for Bucknell University, and really didn't look back since moving up north. I spent about a year in length of time working for a prominent financial firm in Pensacola, Florida, then rerouted right back up to the north after my time there. And it's been 18 years or so in Lewisburg.
What was it about the area that led you to stay here?
Well, God works in amazing ways. I didn't think that I would be in this area for as long as I have. But to be frank, I like the quiet, small town setting. It reminds me of home, at least from the rural aspect of the area. And it has that family orientation. So I've enjoyed it here.
Business is good?
Well, post-COVID, we're holding on as best as we can. I'm not going to tell you that it's been good, but we are surviving. We've been thankfully in business going on nearly 10 years now, and we're rolling with the punches. We've had a number of membership freezes and cancellations due to COVID-19 and working in such a shared space as a fitness studio. But thankfully, we are in the green and our doors are back open again. And so we're working with clients the best that we can.
Okay, let's kind of dive right in here. I'm just wondering, in your formative years growing up, did you deal with racism? This is a two-parter, although for Amy it's only one part because you've been here you're pretty much your whole life. Did you deal with racism growing up, and have you dealt with it here in the Valley? Once again, we'll start with you, Dr. Pearson-Wharton.
Stacey's good. That's what everybody calls me. Yep. So I dealt with racism growing up, even in an urban metropolis like Philadelphia. In fact, one of my really vivid memories is from high school, where myself and a group of other Black and brown girls boarded a bus and went out to an affluent high school for girls on the main line in Philadelphia. And certainly, as you might imagine, that took us right out of our cocoon of safety of our community. And just like with anything, you know, kind of racism is a system. And so there were systemic and institutional things that happened that were problematic, but certainly our experiences with individual people was also at times problematic. I'm grateful for that foundation and the education that I received at that school, but absolutely have dealt with it from a very, very, very young age. I don't remember as much from growing up in the South because I left South Carolina when I was about 9. And so my awareness is a little bit less, but as I've grown older, that has not been the case. Absolutely, I've experienced racism here in the Valley in a myriad of different ways. I've been asked if I was a part of the cleaning crew, even when I was dressed in a business suit. I've been asked about whether at the supermarket about food stamps, and I have been whether I was paying by food stamps, or I've been followed in stores. That there have been moments in time for friends of mine that have been followed by cars and trucks and the N-word thrown at them. And so there have been a myriad of ways that I've experienced racism. Even, and I shared with you, Chris, earlier that my husband has a business, and we do business at the farmers market on Saturdays, and that people have come up to us, well-meaning, but talked about how good coloreds can cook. And so, so there have been some complexities in my experience here in the Valley.
Oh my goodness. Okay. Amy, what about you? Now you've been here your whole life.
Yes,
Have you experienced it?
absolutely. So my background is in education. I have a master's of science in education. So everything I process comes through that lens. And, you know, when you think about developmental theory, we know that children of color start to experience what's called the encounter phase as early as kindergarten and preschool. And that happened to me in this area. I came home after my first days of kindergarten because I had been called a word, and I was very confused and was curious about my race. And that happened with all of my 3 older children. They came home from their first weeks of preschool with major racial questions after experiencing just discriminatory behavior from their peers even. So I've seen it in every angle, being a part of this valley for so long, certainly in our education system, but also just around town, around neighborhoods. My husband passed away in 2017, but before that, being a Black man in this area was very complicated. He had been approached to buy drugs before. You know, he's a professional man in ministry, you know, dressed as Dr. Stacey was saying, dressed professionally, and still was approached to purchase drugs. So certainly, like, it's a part of almost daily experience, whether it's in the form of microaggressions or outright racism. It's certainly a part of growing up in this valley. And I think just one more comment on that, you know, much more meaningful to me than the daily occurrences and the interactions are awful, but I've been privy to a lot of the systemic issues of this valley. When I was in kindergarten, tracking practices in schools were still legal. And so you would see, as classes were split into the normal class and the remedial classes, you would see them split along lines of race and socioeconomics. So that's been a little bit harder of a pill to swallow, to be honest, is the fact that we have a long legacy of racism in this valley, and systemic racism at that.
Nissan, what about you? It's tough listening to this, but yeah, Nissan, I want to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, I also want to echo what Amy just mentioned, which is very powerful. There's a vast difference between interpersonal racism, the microaggressions that we experience, versus systemic racism that has a long history in our country as well, and is a bigger, much larger issue to even try to tackle and address.
Mm-hmm.
I am not opposed of sharing stories. I can give the graphic stories, no question, but I would love to move past the stories to even address systemically what's going on in our culture, because the stories help us with reconciliation. But to echo the words of Dr. Brian C. Johnson, we can't get to a place of reconciliation until we address white supremacy. And I do believe that that's a much larger issue. But to address your question and answer it, growing up in Alabama is very rich in the culture. I mean, I had my second grade teacher punch me. I knew it was because I was a student of color. My dad abruptly came to the school and addressed her head on about that issue. I had my high school teacher single me out. I was only black in the classroom, and asked me to write KKK in front of everybody on a whiteboard to embarrass me. We've had students, my white counterparts as students, dress as blackface for Halloween, well aware of the history of blackface and the roles that people use to mock black people with animalistic characteristics, etc. Confederate flags being paraded in the parking lot, anchored to big trucks with mud tires, celebrating the end of the school year, as the wind whistled through the flags and people were very comfortable seeing those sights. Truthfully, my own personal belief, that knowing that that flag doesn't represent what America has on paper as its morals, its characteristics. Folks dressed up as KKK for Halloween parties and race fights and race riots. I remember a cousin of mine he actually signed with one of the best schools, especially for football in Alabama, Auburn University, but then had his scholarship stripped away due to race fight. And I don't know how justifiable that could be, but those are some of, again, the interpersonal things that are prevalent, and I believe that there's a long list of them. But systemically, we're talking about the wage gap between Black and white America being at a 40-year all-time high, the highest it's been in 40 years. I mean, you look at the poverty rate. The poverty rate among Black Americans is 3 times the amount of white Americans. In 2017, that number was reported. I mean, you can go on and on with just these statistics that prove that systemically we're at a disadvantage. 90% of politicians are white, and on and on and on. So those are the things that also I feel need to be addressed.
So my next question was going to be, what form does it take, subtle or right out in the open? And what I'm hearing is that it's right out there. There's no subtlety at all to what you guys have seen.
It's both. I think that because there's this insidious nature to racism that that is so much a part of the culture that there is a subtlety to it that and I think that's one sometimes is what's confusing for people, because they oftentimes think, well, I'm not using the N-word, or I'm not harassing people, or I'm not burning crosses in my yard, or I don't see color, and that absolves them from the responsibility of dismantling the systemic racism in our country. But the truth of the matter is that you don't have to be doing any of those things to engage in racist behavior and or benefit from white privilege or encouraging white supremacy in our valley and our country.
Yes, and I want to add to that. I know that Amy will probably piggyback off of this too, and I'm completely fine with that. But for me, even when we use the terminology white privilege, I want to be clear from the standpoint of using white privilege isn't suggesting an indictment on a person's morality. And sometimes because an individual feels that way, they automatically get defensive when what I truthfully believe is white privilege isn't as big of an issue if you're willing to leverage your privilege to bring us to a place of equality.
If it's helpful, I can unpack white privilege as this.
Mm-hmm.
White privilege doesn't mean that you haven't struggled. What it means is that you haven't struggled because of your race and ethnicity.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, because I think there's some confusion and there's almost a sense of resentment over that term.
Yes,
From white
Yes.
people.
exactly. And let's be clear that the schema was originally advanced by Dr. Peggy McIntosh, a white woman. And so it's not something that people of color have come up with, but it's from this white scholar who advanced this particular theory. And it is difficult. It is difficult to think about. And what I oftentimes say is, so I'm Black, I'm heterosexual, I'm Christian, and I'm a woman, right? And so I have privilege as a heterosexual person. I certainly have middle class privileges along with being Christian, right? But it doesn't discount the fact that I don't have privilege around my race or ethnicity and my gender.
Yeah. Because if I could go back to your question about subtlety versus kind of in your face too, I think a good example, some of the most frustrating moments for me when it comes to racism in this area have been in PSA meetings and settings where it's coming out not as we don't want Black families to succeed or we don't want brown families to be totally brought into the fold here, but it comes out in very subtle ways, questions about helping with access to the clearance process for folks who don't speak English. People really pushing back on what they've earned, based on their status in the community versus what other families maybe don't deserve. So it's those conversations that have really brought me to my boiling point sometimes, because it points to some ignorance on the systemic issues at hand, on the privileges that Dr. Stacey's talking about, right?
Yeah.
That this idea that we've somehow earned things when really it's part of a much longer history and legacy, coming from colonialism and slavery and Jim Crow and civil rights era. You have all of this history built in. This was native land. We have right here, we have a legacy of colonialism here, so I think we have to really reckon with that history and reckon with even the current, history alive, what's happening right now. And I find that sometimes those conversations are incredibly difficult. So it's those subtle moments that I have a real challenge with as a parent and a community member.
So let's talk about the systemic thing. Go off the question a little bit. How do you reverse that history? Are we seeing that happening now, or is there still such a long way to go for that?
Well, I don't believe that you can necessarily reverse history. I mean, at this point, unfortunately, it is what it is. It's what you're doing now to address it and combat it. Because historically speaking, I mean, privilege has always been utilized to a certain degree to take advantage and marginalize people, gender, etc. I mean, you look at 1920, you have the ability for white women to be able to vote. But then you go to 1965, then finally, Black women are able to vote. But it wasn't until white women decided to come up against their oppressor, who was privileged at the time, white men, to say, all right, we're tired of this. We also want to be able to have our voice heard at the polls. And so that's some oppression being done even within a race, with white men using their privilege at that time to oppress white women. But it's very hard for people to stand up against something that they benefit from. And that's the issue with privilege.
Exactly. Spot on. Yeah. And it's the same, you look at our prison system, our policing system, our
Yes.
education system. I mean, just when you come up against any institution, any kind of system that we have in place, our housing. I mean, think about when they wanted to build a new housing site, an affordable housing site in this area. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, the racial dialogue, the things that came out at that time, it was very ugly. And we come up against that quite a bit in this area. And so I think there are structures that are benefiting folks, you know, and I came up in the Lewisburg School District. I love the district for many reasons, but I so often hear, oh, it's such a great district. And I kind of want to put an asterisk on that and say, you know, we serve the majority very well. We can't deny that. But there are also a lot of folks that, in not just Lewisburg, but in all of our local districts, and that we're just not serving, and that shouldn't be acceptable. And it's the same when it comes to looking at our judicial system and different systems that we really need to take a closer look at. And Nissan's right, we can't reverse. We can't go back. And I think it's going to take some steps that are much more radical than people would like to take, and people giving up some of those privileges. And it's certainly, I'm not a pessimist, but it's a very uphill battle at this point.
How do you feel though now, presently, with what's been going on the past month or two? Do you think we're stepping in the right direction on a national stage?
Personally, I am cautiously optimistic. I am that we are on the pulse of, but I want this movement to be less about pancake mascots and flags and symbols and those kinds of things. And those things are salient and important, but I'd like it to be really about building something new. Because I think what we currently have is so entrenched in the soil. It's like pulling up one of the redwoods in California. And so that's almost impossible. And so it's almost the need to build something new, as opposed to trying to take apart the old.
Yeah. It's hard to be optimistic when Breonna Taylor's murderers are still hanging out. You know, it's hard to say, you know, when things aren't trending anymore, when, you know, the Black Lives Matter tribute in Lewisburg downtown was taken down, when the chalk on Watsontown sidewalks were washed out that said Black Lives Matter. You know, it's hard to say, and the same thing is happening nationally. You know, we're making these steps that really don't have a lot at stake. You know, and again, I'm always going to come back to school. So, you know, slapping in some Black history, great, but we need to be actively seeking and hiring teachers of color. We need to be looking and decolonizing our entire curriculum. We need to be thinking about the way we're engaging families. There's so much more at stake than the little steps, and I think the little steps are easy. But it's going to take a lot more time. You know, it's going to take a lot more time for us to get to where we need to be.
And to answer that question as well and give you my take on it, I am somewhat hopeful and optimistic because that's simply who I am at the core. You know, I believe that God has a plan. While at the same time, I am tired of what feels like these small incremental steps. It's like I'm looking for, when are we going to be able to make a gigantic leap of some sort? And it's hard to climb a mountain. You know, I just look at the gaps for me personally. I mean, when you look at white households being 86 times more wealthier than Black households, that's a significant leap that we're trying to make.
And that's, you know, regardless of education level.
Right.
That's regardless.
And here's also what's interesting too, Dr. Stacey, is, you know, we can talk numbers across multiple platforms, but you look at the mass incarceration rate. You know, our Black men represent 6% of the U.S. population, but is represented in prison population 46% or 40%.
Right.
You know, and so these are the type of issues that I want to see addressed and see numbers change. And because I'm okay with the conversations. Again, there's nothing wrong with them. I think at least people are willing to listen what seems like for the first time, especially given mass media has been controlled by our white counterparts or our white brothers and sisters. I don't even know sometimes want to call them counterparts, but when that is the case and the narrative has been controlled by our white counterparts and we haven't had much to say other than now feeling like, well, we've had a lot to say, but we haven't really been able to get it out in a mass platform the way other outlets are. I'm happy for the conversations, but I want the conversation to be able to point towards what are the numbers specifically to suggest we're making a big leap.
Mm.
So is it your feeling that change will only come legislatively? Is that the only thing that'll bring it, or does there have to be a dramatic change along the lines of the way people like me, the white people, think?
Is that directed toward me or everybody?
Everybody, anyone who wants to jump in.
Okay.
Multimodal. And so I think that there's an old saying in psychology literature. I'm a psychologist by training. I don't think I've ever said that. But was it state ways before folk ways? And so that the legislative pieces are very, very important. And that it's almost necessary but not sufficient. And so it's a good first step. And so when schools were desegregated legally, that didn't take apart the segregation in people's heart.
Yes, exactly.
That's still present. And so that's why the multimodal approach is so important. And I think that, we need to look at all aspects of our culture and our lives to, again, build something new. Because what's true is that racism has seeped into every part of American life.
Well said.
Every single part. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, no, it's so true, because all of the legislation that we've passed up until this point that has attempted to desegregate or to bring some sort of equality has been limited. Every time there have been workarounds, every time there have been ways to achieve voter suppression. There have been ways to achieve, legal slavery with our prison system. All of the legislation we've passed to date, we've still found ways to create or maintain, I should say, incredibly unequal and unjust systems. And so we need it at all levels, but it's beyond the point of a law will fix it.
And I also truthfully believe when you look at the multiple dimensions of racism, from institutional, structural, interpersonal, even internalized racism, which sometimes can be hard to address during times like this, but it still does exist. The fact that colorism is a thing within the race, and depending on your skin tone, and if you're more closely connected to a darker skin complexion, then you probably are going to be disadvantaged as compared to somebody inside your very own race who is of a lighter skin tone. So all of these things are a part of what is racism. And I like the words of Tony Dungy. He says that we can pass all the legislation that we want, but that really won't matter as much as a change in our heart. And so, because even when we pass legislation, it's the content of our character and how we carry out that legislation with what's inside of our heart that's going to make the biggest difference.
Mm-hmm.
I can't help but ask, obviously this has a dramatic, tremendous effect on how you live as a person. And how has that affected your comfort level living in this area?
So on Sunday, I am launching a podcast called Being the Dot. And it's about African Americans thriving in white spaces. And I started it, quite frankly, because of my own experience of living in this hyper white space that we currently are living in. I feel that my husband and I have been able to build a life here, and it's a good one. And so I don't want to play like that's not the case, because it is. And there are moments in time where I feel sad and afraid and frustrated and disappointed. And this whole season, one of the most hurtful things has been, for me personally, that people that I thought would stand with me have stood up and turned their backs on me. And so people that I have gone to war for because of their pain, because that's what I do for a living. Like, that's my calling, is to help people manage their pain as a psychologist. And so people that I have gone to war have chosen to not even consider to stand with me in that season. And that has broken my heart. But I will tell you that race-based stress is a real thing, that it has been widely studied, both in the lives of African Americans, but also my Latino brothers and sisters, Native American and Asian American Pacific Islander, that you see higher rates of hypertension. You also see diabetes. Certainly the COVID-19 illuminated this in a way that we could have never expected. And that there's this root of also depression and anxiety that can be picked up. And oftentimes the scholars talk about it as being trauma. And similar to people who have maybe discrete traumatic experiences, seeing somebody killed, or just a myriad of things. But that the racism experience, there's this cumulative impact, because oftentimes that there's the daily dealing with it in some shape, form, or fashion. And so that's a long answer, I'm aware, to your question. But we have made it work, and I believe that that healing will come from some of those relationships that have been painful to manage in this season.
Just say that being a parent of brown and black children right now makes daily life in white spaces really challenging, really, really difficult. So that's one of the things that's been on my heart the most right now. I have a teenage son, I have teenage children, I have little ones, and there's a lot of confusion right now with my little ones, my 2 and 4-year-old, about when they're hearing things, they're like, wait, did that really happen? And I have to tell them yes, and sit and have the conversations, and then, letting my older children out of the house, and knowing kind of the tension that's around right now. I'm sure you've seen some of it, but some of the social media posts have been horrific. Threatening violence and threatening just some horrible, horrible things. So that's probably on my heart the most. But to echo Dr. Stacey, certainly there's been a lot of disappointment in relationships right now. And I'm all about reconciliation and love above all. So it hasn't changed how I feel about anybody, but I've had to really come to terms with some harsh realities.
And I like what Dr. Stacey said about, and I haven't heard this terminology, but the hyper white space, because that's exactly what it is when you just break down the numbers. So I like to look into the numbers of things, if you haven't been able to tell, but like 76% of the U.S. population is white. Union County, where we exist and live, is 86% of the population is white. So Union County is whiter than all of America. So it's very evident when living here, where 6% of this population is black. And when you narrow it down to being a minority within a minority, for me as a black business owner, you always wear your blackness. It is no way around that with how the world exists at large, but even at a micro level with where I live currently. So for every single one of us talking with you today, Chris, we are the rose that comes up through the concrete. We are the exception. We're not the rule. So yes, we are aware of the fact that life is good to us, maybe perhaps in comparison, depending on what you compare with other brothers and sisters inside of our community. but we're certainly not satisfied with where we are, because just simply for our children being of their skin color, us having our skin color the way that it is, we're very aware of the disadvantages we have, and it's hard to have rest, but more so there's social unrest. And I can relate to that fatigue that Dr. Stacey is talking about, where it just there is an emotional and also physical response, because once you're awakened, you don't go back to sleep.
Amy, you alluded to this real quickly. You talked about how, you know, your older boys leave the house, and we hear a lot about the fear that a young black man or someone of your age, Nissan, feels when they leave the house, that they may not come back. Is that a grim reality of this?
Oh my gosh, yes. And it's really hard because all my children have ever known is this area. And so there's this false sense of safety sometimes, you know, but I grew up here too, and I saw the differences in the way that my specifically Black male friends were treated by community members, police officers, the judicial system. So I know it, and I want to protect my son, my 13-year-old son, who really looks 16 or 17. I want to protect his innocence and protect his notion that he's the exact same as all of his friends, while also preparing him. So, you know, I tell him all the time, if your friends run away from a situation, you stand still, and your hands need to be visible, and you need to make eye contact and speak slowly and deliberately. Don't make sudden movements. You know, all of this is a reality. And some folks would argue that that's instilling fear, but it's that one time. All it takes is that one time where the lack of preparation, you know, can result in something tragic. So, yeah, it makes me very nervous, and not just for the big things, but even the little things. I know how he's going to be perceived. Not a little boy anymore. He's perceived as a young Black man, and I don't want him to be made to feel like anything less than he is. He's an artist. He's a musician. He's a football player. He's smart. He's sweet. He loves his mom. He tells me he loves me every night. He hugs me. He likes to be held. You know, he's my baby. And I want to protect that, but I know that that's not what folks are going to see when he's walking down the street with his friends. They see his cornrows, they see his earrings, they see his gait, his muscles. He's a big built kid, so it's hard. It's very scary.
Yeah, and as opposed to Amy with her son, who's older than my boys, right now it is a balance of sharing enough information but not sharing too much, so as to not scare them. So we're trying to help them understand that, yes, this world is going to see them differently, but they're not better than anybody, and no one's better than them. So we have to continue to push the narrative. I believe it's incumbent upon everybody to push this narrative, because this is just what history would suggest. The notion needs to be white people need to understand and address that they're not superior. Mm-hmm. Black people need to understand and address that we aren't inferior.
That's awesome. And I guess I want to contextualize as well this a little bit, if I can, from a psychological place. I'll just tell this quick anecdote first. So the Friday night after the George Floyd killings, my husband wanted to go to take some cakes to the commercial kitchen that we rent. And it was 11 o'clock at night. And typically I'd be like, okay, good night, love you, let's pray. Because I'm going to bed. But I really had a very visceral reaction. And what I said to him is, you can't go at this time because somebody's going to think you're breaking into the facility. They're going to kill you. And what there's a psychological theorist called Greer and Cobbs, and they talk about that being healthy cultural paranoia. And basically that is a survival technique. Wow. Color have to have in this country, because yes. That hypervigilance and awareness, you could end up in a situation that is dangerous for you, and whether that is physically dangerous or economically dangerous or some other form of safety we have to teach our children this just so they can survive. Yes.
Wow. So how does the George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, all these instances that happen, how do they make you feel when they happen? What's your first reaction when something like that happens?
I'll go first. I try to remind myself not to be desensitized to it because we see it playing out over and over again. And isn't that a crazy reality to come to grips with? Is that I shouldn't treat this like a TikTok video.
Mm-hmm.
None of that, even though it's being shared on a similar platform.
Mm.
That I have to remind myself that this is someone's life being taken right in front of our face. And so for me, the feeling is, believe it or not, to feel what I'm supposed to be feeling as a human in that moment so that it can cause me to respond in a way so that it doesn't happen again.
Mm.
Stacey, Amy?
It looks like you're ready for me to talk. You need a
Go
minute.
ahead.
Okay. So I agree with Nissan about the desensitization, and I actually interviewed about 30 people the week of the George Floyd murder about their reaction to it, including some children. And what I found is that there are people who watch the videos and people who don't, in either camp. And I'm a non-video watcher, that the trauma of it is more than I want to continue to bear. I stopped watching them right around Philando Castile's murder. And so I haven't, but the George Floyd one was so pervasive that it was hard to miss it. And so I know enough about what happened in the video because of how pervasive it was in media. Having said that, I feel typically very sad. I tend to think about the people who are vicariously impacted, right? That, what about his mama? Well, his mother is dead, or the children, and I find myself being very empathic with them and spending a lot of time praying for them and those kinds of things. And then I also find myself very frustrated and oftentimes angry, like, will this ever change, or why does this continue to happen? And aren't we human too? And people have got to stop dehumanizing Black men. They don't have a tail, like they bleed just like everybody else. And then it also makes me oftentimes want to do something. Like, so what's my responsibility in this? I have to be careful because I don't want to work over the feelings, right? And so that I'm doing something so much that I miss what's happening for me psychologically, emotionally, even spiritually. But it is not easy, and it's not murder porn either, right? And that piece, the reenactment of the George Floyd murders by multiple people, has been infuriating. Yes.
Nissan said this, and I don't want to shift the focus to white people. But first off, Nissan said that white people have to feel like they're not superior. What else do white people have to do to help bring about the change that's necessary?
Part of the reason with that question, Chris, if I could take an issue with it, is this wasn't a problem created by Black people. This has to be a solution that is created by those who created it.
Yes.
So there needs to be more intuitive thought to search within to find that answer. It is not up necessarily for me to come up with ways by which someone should stop abusing me. When they're the oppressor, they're the abuser. So I don't mind the question. I think maybe others are wrestling with that same question. But when people sometimes come for solutions when they can read books themselves, watch podcasts themselves, look for Black leaders within the community who have already addressed these issues. That sometimes, I don't know how the other ladies feel, so I'm not able to speak for them. Obviously, we're not a monologue here. I'm just saying, for me personally, racism wasn't created by us, so those that created it need to learn how to fix what they created.
I 100% agree with Nissan, but for the folks who really want some low-hanging fruit to access, I will say check your racist family and your friends. Of course, check your own racism, educate yourself, but you know, I don't want to get away from that absolute truth that, you know, it's got to be a solution that is seriously sought after by the folks who created the problem. But I think right now is almost like a zero tolerance kind of thing. Like, you know, we should not be just being quiet at the table when, you know, that family member makes that joke, or, you know, those are the things, like, at the bare minimum that have to be happening. There has to be a line drawn in the sand by white people for other white people. This is absolutely unacceptable. Beyond that, yeah, there's a lot of work to be done that I think needs to come from within.
I agree. And Nissan, I agree with your exception with the question. I think that you are dead on there. And I feel obligated at some level as someone who does diversity training to just offer a couple pieces of things that I think would be helpful. First of all, Google.com. Start right there. Like there is a plethora of information available out there for us that one does not have to struggle to figure out what to do, right? But a couple things. There's a great book called Just for Language's Sake, because language matters, right? 35 dumb things well-intended people say. Why do all the Black kids sit together in the cafeteria? White supremacy and me, white fragility. All great reads. Stamped from the beginning just lays out how race entered into this country and the economic basis for it. Like, all great reads. Certainly my own podcast, Being the .com, which will premiere on Sunday, July 4th at 5 p.m. And Educating Themselves, another great podcast, is 1619 by the New York Times. I would also recommend that you use your privilege for good. And so, and by doing that you practice being anti-racist. It is no longer okay to just say, well, I'm not racist, I'm good. That's necessary, again, but not sufficient. Amplify Black voices. And so when you hear somebody say something, or they're offended, or in the store, something is going on, and you see somebody not treating a person of color correctly, you say something. That's a great way to use your power for good and move from being apathetic to being more of an advocate. We need you. Like, we cannot, first of all, we are tired, right? And white people, we need you to help with this situation, or we want to help you figure it out yourselves, because it's not necessarily our work to do. And so please, I beg people to be on the right side of history as it relates to this. Like, we can build something. I really believe we can build something different, and it's going to be hard and messy and difficult, but worth it.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Well said. So the other issue that came up from George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, Rayshard Brooks, was the relationship between Black residents, Black people, and police officers in police departments. What can or should be done to improve relations between the two? Anyone?
That's a big question. There's several ways to address that too. I do believe there needs to be more diversification among staff, so that we who are underrepresented can have more representation. And when I say that, I also believe that for how the structure of it works with the place of employment of these departments, throwing in someone, mind you, who's a rookie into underprivileged communities to police that community when they don't really have any interaction and they aren't even considered as good right now because they are rookies, not veterans with experience on their job. No wonder we're having a number of these issues. I mean, we need to tear down what they call the blue wall of silence, where cops need to start to tell on cops who have a long rap sheet and history of being very aggressive, using racial slurs. This needs to be a thing. You know, you have a number of different things that of course, just with training, like I wonder how much diversity, equality, inclusion training do police officers have at their disposal to understand the plight of Black America. So those are some of the places that I would start in terms of improving the relationships. They got a number of other things, but I want to give the floor to them too.
I think you also have to look at the origins of our police force in the United States. You know, in the South, it was the slave patrol.
Yes.
Right. Absolutely.
In the North, you know, we had a little better of an origin. You know, it was a night watch, really, is where our first, before we had constables and all of that, it was a night watch. And they would also do things like check on land measurements and make sure that people were upholding those sorts of things. But when you think about the fact that our police force began in part, at least in half of our country, or part of our country, as a slave patrol, you have to look at these structures. You have to question, you know, how can something birthed and the roots of something be so unjust? And, you know, we can't just have, and I also do diversity and inclusion training as a big part of my work. But, you know, the revolution is not going to be diversity and inclusion trainings. That will be part of it for sure, but it's so much bigger than that. It's about revamping an entire system and questioning, what are our purposes? Where are the lines? How do we go from public servants to public enemy? You know, how do we look at the role of police officers? How do we fund our community organizations and social services in a way that, you know, police officers aren't the catch-all for things that they really aren't trained to do? And so that is a huge part of the concern, is that we need to really look at the scope of the job. That's a first step, because absolutely there are things that police officers are incredibly crucial for. You know, I've had to rely on them quite a few times over the years, and I'm grateful for our police officers, but there are also situations that they right now are called to respond to that simply, they're not the right person for the job. I really hope that you don't call me if your house is on fire, or if you need emergency surgery. I'm not the right person for that job. And so I think we really need to question the scope and the realities.
I agree with you. And I think about Rashad Brooks's murder.
Mm-hmm.
And that they were called out because he was drunk and sleep in the car. And so you think about it, levels 1, 2, and 3, right? And so 3 is the police. Would he still be alive? How about that? Would he still be alive if there was a level 1 person whose duty it was to deal with intoxicated people? Because when you go to level 3 to law enforcement, to police, that immediately escalates it. 3 can be back up to 1 versus the other way around. And it really, it goes back to what I was talking about earlier about building something different. And I agree with Nissan's contention around really diversifying these groups, but I also think as you diversify, that they need to also be inclusive. And so that you're not bringing people to the table to expect them to, okay, so we got the outer shell straight, but you need to operate in this way. And so that in the building something new, that you allow cultural pieces to be a part of this. A great example, there's a viral video out there right now that this officer is detaining this woman, and the officer appears to be an African-American person, and the woman does as well. And she's kind of dancing and singing and all kinds of stuff during this time of she's being detained. He is not fazed by it. And part of the reason that he is not phased because he probably has a cousin that would do the same thing. So that's part of the value of diversifying the staff and the teams, particularly as it relates to law enforcement, is being able to have somebody with that different perspective. I also think that there has to be a rebuilding of the trust.
Yes.
Right now, there is a lack of trust on both sides, in fact. But in my job, if somebody is struggling to trust me, it is up to me to do the work to try to repair and correct that. It is not up to that person. It's my job. That's what I get paid to do. And so I think the same is true for law enforcement and for police. And I have a great relationship both with our campus public safety, the Selinsgrove police, that they know me. I told you earlier that we have a lack of anonymity because of where we live and of what I do. And, I'm in traffic with them all the time, particularly as it relates to mental health emergencies. And what I know is that some of the other people that they serve, that trust has got to be rebuilt.
And if I could, just briefly, I'll try. I want to speak to both like the origin that Amy spoke of, and then also Dr. Stacey talking about the trust, because if you go back to 1865, Emancipation Proclamation, and the fact that once slaves realized they were free, really what took place was them fleeing from the South because of the acts of terrorism and going to places where they felt safe, really as a refugee in their own country.
Mm.
And now, as a consequence of that, those slave owners who in fact used slaves to pick their cotton, etc., now find a way to circumvent the system. This is where we get the mass incarceration from. If you really want to go way back, this is where it comes from. And then actually jail slaves, imprison Black people with misdemeanor accounts so that they could still work the fields and do everything else as a consequence of free labor. So now that is, in fact, where we derive from today when we date back that far in history. So that foundation is built on a lack of trust. And that origin is, speaking to Amy's point of what is our purpose. I'm not saying that, I do believe police have their place in society and they're valuable. This is certainly not what I'm saying. But I am also questioning, and I'm having us, I feel, wrestle with the fact of what is the purpose at this point, given what we continue to see really in rapid succession here with Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and how can we establish that trust given the history that we know? Because obviously the history that we know isn't serving us right now the way that it should.
Okay, just wrap up real quick. As we stand at this point in time in this day, are you hopeful? Or is there a feeling of fear at this point in time, or even resignation that things will never change and will just, after this moment passes, it'll just slide back to the way it was before?
All of the above.
Okay.
So I talked earlier about being cautiously optimistic, and that is true. That I think, we're on the pulse of morning, as Maya Angelou would say, on the precipice of something great, right? And I do. I think that is true. But what I also know is that the more anti-racism work happens and rises, the greater racism. And I think the best example of that is some of the scary footage that I've seen of the anti-Black Lives Matter protesters.
Yes.
That to me is scary. And in fact, I admire my brother Nissan and my sister Amy that they've chosen to put their bodies on the line, but I'm too old and I'm scared. And so I've chosen to fight in other ways. And so thank you for that. And so to me, it's all of the above. And I've resigned that we may never see a change in the kind of change that we need in my lifetime.
Mm.
So to me, it's not either or, it's all of the above. I mean, but I want to say, I never thought that I would see a Black president, ever. I never thought, I thought, well, I'll be old and I won't remember, and they'll be like, Big Mama, we got a Black president, you know, like that. But that's not quite how it happened. So, so sometimes I am pleasantly surprised. And I'm hoping for that. I got my fingers crossed around it.
I think Amy would do a better job of closing us out, so I'll jump in here first and just say, or before her, and say I'm hopeful from the standpoint of how we look generationally at the energy of people. This isn't to say that baby boomers haven't been out and about, but they're standing up against the cause. But when you look at the Generation Zers who are growing up with more of a mixture of different people, etc., you know, they didn't have to fight with Jim Crow and the desegregation of schools. By and large, a number of them are growing up with each other as compared to older generations. And I believe that's why they have the type of energy that they have to affect change. And so I'm hopeful, especially as our younger generation continues to pursue social justice, because it appears as if when you're doing an injustice to one of them, especially given the color of their skin, it feels like you're also doing it to them personally. And so it really does seem as if we have some momentum right now. So I'm hopeful.
Dr. Stacey brought up the protests. You know, I was there on Sunday. There's been a Newsweek article about some of the vitriol we faced. But what you don't see is that some of those folks actually that have their faces and their videos being spread all over social media right now because of the hate that they brought. Me and two of my brothers were standing with them, having a conversation. And when it wouldn't go any further, we all grabbed hands, all of us, including those women and their children, and we prayed.
Wow.
And there were tears and there were hugs. Nobody swayed anybody's opinion, but the love was real. And so it can't stop there. There has to be more, but I feel like this is not a sprint. It's a marathon. Mm-hmm. And I can still be in this marathon if it wasn't for hope, if it wasn't for, justice will win out one day regardless, right? Love will win out. Light will win out. And so maybe I won't see it. Maybe my children won't see it. Maybe it'll be my grandchildren. But I am in it. I'm in it for the long haul. I'm in it for this community. I'm in it for this world. And I think that when I look in my children's eyes, I see great hope. Their hearts are so pure. They are seeking justice themselves. And so that is where my hope lies. And I believe it's so ironic. And I'll say this, and we don't have time to talk about it, but our community has not been very good to young Black men historically. And we are being led right now in this movement around here by a group of 7 young men called If Not Us, Then Who? And I just find so much justice in that and so much vindication in that. And I'm just following in line. I'm just supporting them. And so I have great hope for the younger generations, and I'm here. And maybe I will be the old grandma, and they'll be saying, we finally made it, we did this, and I'm here for it. So there is fear, there's all of that, but I think above all there's hope and there's love and there's justice.
Well put. Boy, Nissan, you were right. It was perfect to have her go last. And I thank you, Nissan Trott from Trott Fitness. Thank you very much for your time today. Amy Davis from Susquehanna University and Dr. Stacey Pearson-Wharton. Thank you very much from Susquehanna University. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you for having us, and thank you for hosting this conversation.
Incredibly honored. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your time. And that's going to do it for this special episode of In Your Neighborhood. I'm your host, Chris O'Rourke. Thanks for joining us.